They didn't remove Elena Ward because she failed. And they removed her because she asked a question no one wanted asked in public. And in rooms like that, the wrong question can cost more than a mistake, because a mistake can be forgiven, but a disruption of control cannot. Elena had joined Whitmore & Co. 6 months earlier, quietly, without the mythology Daniel liked to attach to himself. She wasn't part of the origin story. She wasn't a day one. She didn't share inside jokes with the board. She didn't have years of dinners, favors, and old loyalties to lean on. She had one thing instead. She had accuracy. That's what the company hired her for. Not charm, not diplomacy, accuracy. When their expansion forecasts started drifting into fantasy, when the numbers stopped behaving the way PowerPoint promised they would, Daniel did what charismatic leaders often do. He brought in a specialist, someone who could stabilize the system while he stabilized the narrative. And Elena did stabilize it. She reorganized operational reporting in 3 weeks. She cut waste without triggering layoffs that would scare investors. She restructured vendor contracts so quietly that no one complained, until they realized the savings were real. People didn't applaud her for it. They simply began to rely on it. And reliance can feel like threat to someone who prefers to be the center of every solution. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp on a Tuesday. Glass walls, steel frames, a skyline behind Daniel that made him look permanently elevated, as if the city itself had agreed to support his authority. Elena arrived early, not to impress anyone, but because she believed that being prepared was a form of respect for the company, for the role, and for the reality behind the presentation. She placed her laptop on the table, connected the deck, checked the remote twice. Then she waited. One by one, the board arrived. Familiar faces, old alliances, people who spoke softly but moved money loudly. Margaret Hall came in last. Margaret never rushed. She didn't need to. Her reputation did the walking for her. Elena nodded to her politely. Margaret returned it, slight and unreadable. Then Daniel entered, and the room changed without anyone saying a word. It wasn't fear, it was comfort. He carried comfort with him the way some men carry cologne, subtle, expensive, and designed to be noticed only when it's absent. "Good morning," Daniel said, smiling as if he meant it personally to every person in the room. He moved around the table, gentle touches on shoulders, soft jokes, the kind that said, "We're on the same side." When he sat, he didn't dominate the space. He hosted it. That's the thing about leadership, someone once told Elena. It's not about being right. It's about being the person everyone wants to be right. Daniel understood that instinctively. Margaret opened the meeting with the agenda: operational updates, expansion vote, investor confidence notes. Then Elena's section. She stood calm and began. Her slides were clean, minimal. Numbers first, assumptions second, consequences always. She didn't perform, she explained. And for the first few minutes, the board listened, not because they loved the details, but because her details had stopped them from embarrassing themselves the last time the market shifted. Elena moved to the expansion forecast. She didn't change her tone. She didn't dramatize. She simply pointed to the assumptions. The current plan assumes a 14% market capture within 2 quarters, she said. Now, based on comparable rollouts and our current staffing bandwidth, that assumption is optimistic. It was one word. Optimistic? She didn't say reckless. She didn't say irresponsible. She didn't say unrealistic. She chose the gentlest, accurate word available. And still, she felt the temperature change. A pause in breathing, a small movement of a hand, a board member's eyes flicking toward Daniel before returning to her. She kept going because she assumed the room cared about reality more than tone. That was her mistake. A small one, a social one. But in a boardroom, small social mistakes do not remain small. Daniel let the silence sit for half a second. He didn't rush to rescue the mood. He allowed it to form a shape. Then he smiled, warm as ever. "I appreciate the scrutiny, Elena," he said. "That's why we value your input." It sounded supportive. It sounded fair. It made him look generous. And it made her look like the person who had just created tension that he had to manage. He turned slightly toward the board, still smiling. "Let's remember," Daniel continued, "business isn't only math. It's timing, momentum, the story we tell investors before the quarter closes." Elena knew he wasn't wrong. Narrative did matter. Confidence did matter. But confidence built on weak assumptions collapses. She wanted to say that. Instead, she chose discipline. "Momentum is fragile," Elena said. "If we proceed without revised safeguards, our downside exposure increases by 22%. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't attack him. She did what she believed leaders should do. She warned the room before a preventable mistake became an unavoidable crisis. A board member, older, experienced, said softly, "Delaying may signal hesitation." Elena answered, "Delaying signals control." She meant, "We're thoughtful." They heard, "You're difficult." Daniel's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened for a moment, so subtle that only someone trained to read patterns would notice. Then he softened again. "We're all aligned on protecting the company," Daniel said, as if he were smoothing a wrinkle in fabric. "I just want to make sure we don't confuse caution with paralysis." He didn't say Elena was paralyzing them. He didn't have to. The implication landed where it was meant to land. Margaret watched without expression, hands folded. Elena noticed, and for a moment, she wondered if Margaret was evaluating her competence or her politics. Daniel moved to the next agenda item with ease, and then, like it had been sitting in his pocket the entire time, he introduced something else. "I'd like to propose an operational adjustment for the board to consider," Daniel said. "A restructuring of executive oversight." Elena didn't flinch outwardly, but inside she recognized the language: restructuring, adjustment, oversight, words that softened the sound of removal. A board member asked, "What exactly are you proposing?" Daniel leaned back slightly, palms open, tone calm. "Nothing punitive," he said. "Just practical." He glanced toward Elena with what looked like respect. "Elena is exceptionally capable," he continued, "but her approach is highly technical." A pause, then a small smile. "And at this stage, we need leadership that balances analysis with cohesion." Cohesion? That word again. Cohesion meant don't disrupt the comfort of the group. Cohesion meant keep things pleasant. Cohesion meant let Daniel steer the room without resistance. Elena kept her voice steady. "If there are concerns about my approach, I'd like them documented," she said, "specifically, so I can address them." It was a reasonable request. In a normal organization, it would have been applauded. In this room, it was a problem. Because documenting concerns turns feelings into evidence, and evidence creates accountability. Daniel chuckled softly, as if amused by her diligence. "Of course," he said, "and I respect that." Then he tilted his head slightly, like a friend offering advice. But documentation isn't always the point, Elena. Trust is. Trust. The board liked that word. Trust was simple, emotional, flexible. Trust could excuse vagueness. Trust could survive missing metrics. Trust could hide motivations. And Daniel had trust in abundance, built over years, reinforced by charm, protected by loyalty. Elena looked around the table. No one looked hostile. No one looked cruel. They looked comfortable with Daniel. Comfort is a form of power. A quiet board member asked, "So what's the motion?" Daniel didn't rush. He let the room settle into his framing. "We shift Elena out of board oversight and into an advisory capacity," he said. "Effective immediately." He paused, letting the "immediately" land softly. "She will still contribute," he added, "in a way that preserves cohesion." Elena felt the edges of the decision close around her. This wasn't an argument she could win with numbers, because the numbers weren't the point anymore. She chose one last attempt at clarity. "You're removing me from decision-making," she said. Daniel's face showed concern, like he hated that she saw it that way. "Temporarily adjusting your role," he corrected gently, "to protect the company. And honestly, to protect you from unnecessary friction." That was the trap. He framed her removal as kindness. If she protested, she would look emotional. If she accepted, she would look subordinate. Either way, he kept control. Margaret spoke then, voice calm. "Elena," she said, "do you have anything further to add before we vote?" Elena didn't plead. She didn't sell herself. She did not perform fear. She simply said, "My concerns remain. I believe the risk is measurable, but I understand the board's decision." A beat. The board voted, hands raised in quiet sequence. No one looked delighted. No one looked guilty. That's how corporate harm is usually done, without drama, without cruelty, just with procedure. Margaret concluded, "Motion carried." Elena nodded once. She closed her laptop. Daniel leaned slightly toward her as she gathered her things. "I hope you know this isn't personal," he said softly. Elena met his eyes, and her voice stayed calm. "That's what worries me," she replied. Then she walked out. In the hallway, the silence felt louder than any insult, because silence in a glass building isn't emptiness, it's message. She reached the elevator, pressed the button, waited. Her reflection stared back at her in polished steel, composed, unreadable. She looked like someone who had lost. But people misunderstand what losing looks like. Losing is not when you're removed from a room. Losing is when you stop seeing the room clearly. Elena still saw everything. Down in the lobby, people moved around her as if the air had shifted. Some avoided her eyes. Some offered polite half-smiles. No one asked what happened. It was easier for them not to know. She stepped outside into the city, and the noise hit her like a different life. For the first time that morning, she allowed the emotion to rise, only slightly. Not rage, not humiliation, a thin, sharp disappointment, not because she was removed, because the company had chosen comfort over control. That choice would cost them. And Elena wasn't sure yet whether she would still be there when it did. At home, she didn't collapse into a couch. She didn't call anyone to vent. She did what she always did when reality became unclear. She looked for structure. She opened her laptop. She pulled up the contract and investor agreements that no one reads until they have to. Not because she wanted a weapon, because she wanted to understand what the board had risked to remove her. She navigated through documents like a person walking through a building they designed, efficiently without hesitation. She found the institutional investor agreement, the one Daniel liked to reference in meetings when he talked about confidence. She searched terms: governance, continuity, integrity, and there it was. A section heading that made her pause. Continuity of executive integrity. She didn't understand it immediately, so she read it again, then again, and the meaning formed slowly, like a door opening. Major governance changes affecting board oversight require documented, measurable justification, performance-based grounds. A clear record of why. Not cultural discomfort, not vague cohesion, not alignment. The board had removed her using language that sounded safe. But language isn't protection. When investors want documentation, they had voted, and in doing so, they had created a vulnerability, one that didn't threaten the company first. It threatened the person who had guided the vote, Daniel. Elena sat still for a moment, not celebrating, not plotting, just recognizing a fact. They hadn't beaten her with brilliance. They had beaten her with politics. And in politics, documentation is gravity. Gravity doesn't take sides, it simply pulls. She drafted an email, short, neutral, professional, no accusations, no emotional undertone. Subject line, clarification request, governance continuity clause. She addressed it to internal legal counsel, and she copied Margaret Hall. Because Margaret would understand what a neutral question could trigger, Elena reread the email once, removed a sentence that sounded too pointed, kept it clean. Then she sent it. There was no dramatic music, no triumphant smile, just a click, and a system beginning to shift. They thought the decision had closed the matter. It hadn't. Not every move is meant to be seen, and this one had only just begun.